This man is no longer Attorney General of the United States. This man is no longer Deputy Attorney General of the United States. And this man, the special prosecutor in the Watergate affair, this man has been fired under orders issued by the President of the United States.
From CBS News in Washington, this is a special report. Here is CBS White House correspondent Dan Rather.
Good evening. In breathtaking succession tonight, the following historic events occurred. The President of the United States demanded that the Attorney General fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who was supervising the bringing to justice of all persons involved in the Watergate case and related crimes. The Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, refused and resigned. The President then ordered the Assistant Attorney General, the deputy to Elliot Richardson, William Ruckelshaus, to fire the Special Prosecutor. Ruckelshaus refused. The President immediately fired Ruckelshaus. Solicitor General Robert Bork quickly was named Acting Attorney General. Bork was ordered to fire Special Prosecutor Cox. He did. The FBI, acting upon orders from the President, sealed off the Special Prosecutor's office. At the White House, Press Secretary Ronald Ziegler came out at nightfall to put into motion the rapid sequence of upheavals in the top ranks of the executive branch of government. He made it official. Nelson Benton was there.
Dan, the tremors that were generated at the White House by Archibald Cox's news conference this afternoon were hardly visible on the surface. In fact, they were slight, but they were obvious perhaps because everybody expected something and they had a pretty good idea of what to expect. First of all, there was a limousine in the west side driveway of the White House this afternoon with a number 77. It turned out to be Elliot Richardson's limousine, and when reporters spotted him leaving the White House, they knew that some sort of denouement was in progress. We found out later that he stayed with the President for about 30 minutes. There were some hints, some of them hardly spoken, that it was incumbent upon the White House to do or say something after Archibald Cox had outlined what his course would be in the courts regarding the President and what Cox considered his refusal to obey the decree of a court. When the House cleaning was finally announced, it was done very briefly. It took only 5 minutes. First, the details of Cox's firing, then the details of Elliot Richardson resigning as Attorney General, and just a few lines from Press Secretary Ron Ziegler about the firing of William Ruckelshaus as the Deputy Attorney General. The toughest of the White House words were aimed at Archibald Cox, Ziegler contrasting Cox's, quote, refusal to proceed in the same spirit of accommodation as that of the President. Complete, Ziegler said, with his announced intention to defy instructions from the President at a time of serious world crisis. That terse briefing of reporters was not followed by the usual round of questioning because the advanced speculation in the press room of the White House had been that there would be 1, 2, or 3 going from the administration, and though it was expected, it was 3, and despite its predictability, it seemed very sudden at the time and seems very sudden now, Dan.
Thank you, Nelson. Congress, of course, is away for the weekend, and the momentous events that were announced a little over 24 hours ago and climaxed with the resignation, the 1 resignation, and 2 firings this evening, are having quite an impact on the men of Congress. More about that in 1 minute. What happened tonight is the climax to a drama that began last night. The President had the White House announce what was called a compromise on the Watergate tapes last evening. The plan, as announced, was to have summaries of some portions of some tapes given to the Watergate Committee and to a federal district court. Under this plan, Mississippi's Senator John Stennis would verify the summaries as accurate. Stennis could listen to certain portions of certain tapes to do this if he thought listening was necessary. Now, my colleague Daniel Shore has been gathering congressional reaction to what has followed in the wake of that. Dan, what is the reaction?
Well, Dan, Congress really is tossed the gauntlet in a 1-sentence statement that was made by Cox when he said tonight that whether ours shall continue to be a government of laws and not of men is now for Congress and ultimately for the American people. But a weekend is not a time to find Congress facing up resolutely to challenges or to anything else. The first reactions that you get on the telephone from members of the Senate and Congress are mainly threaded with words like shocked and startled. One of the first specific proposals came tonight from Chairman Ervin of the Senate Watergate Committee, speaking in Asheville, North Carolina, a proposal that Congress itself take over the Watergate prosecution.
Congress undoubtedly has the power under the Constitution to establish a special congressional investigating committee. That's been held by the Supreme Court many times. And Congress has the power to prescribe who is going to prosecute a case, just as it did in the Teapot Dome case, where they took it out of the hands of the Justice Department and put it in the hands of an independent prosecutor by a statute. But of course, Congress, any statute that Congress passes is subject to a veto. I would favor the passage of a statute that would establish an independent prosecutor in these particular cases, just as was done in the Teapot Dome case.
In Huntsville, Tennessee, Vice Chairman Howard Baker of the Watergate Committee was milder, but he also sees the situation coming to a head in Congress.
I'm surprised at this development. I am sorry for it. I have a high regard for Attorney General Richardson and for Bill Ruckelshaus, the Deputy Attorney General. It brings the issue clearly to a head, I suppose, and is unexpected. It no doubt will participate further debate in the Congress and a rather heated discussion of the action the President has taken tonight.
There are others speaking more sharply. For example, Senator Kennedy called it a reckless act of desperation by a president who is afraid of the Supreme Court, who is bent on maintaining the cover-up at any cost. And Kennedy says the burden is now on Congress and the courts to nullify this historic insult to the rule of law and to the nation's system of justice. That, of course, is a quote. It may be too early to say what Nixon critics in Congress will try to do, but there is some impeachment talk in the air. So far, not very much, but we've only had a few hours. Impeachment proposals so far from Senator Mondale, Democrat, from Senator Case, Republican. And Chairman John Anderson of the House Republican Conference calls this a constitutional crisis. He predicts there will be impeachment resolutions offered next week. Similar statements from Representatives Jerome Waldy of California, from Ogden Reed of New York. And Republican Senator Edward Brooke, without specifically mentioning impeachment, he says that the firing of Cox should be taken up by the House, and that the body, of course, which initiates impeachment. Liberals on the Senate Judiciary Committee, which worked out that agreement for Cox's independence, they want an immediate meeting of that committee to deal with what Senator John Tunney calls a monstrous action. To do what isn't exactly sure, but at the very least it appears that the president will have some trouble, Dan, getting a new attorney general confirmed.
Dan, getting back to the Watergate Committee, and as I think most everyone understands, that the Watergate case has been proceeding along two parallel, in some cases, but separate rails. One has been the Senate Watergate Committee. Two, the special prosecutor in the Justice Department, Archibald Cox. Now, dealing with the committee, the sequence of events, the President had the White House announce last night what he called a compromise. The indication from the White House was the Watergate Committee had accepted this plan, that the plan at that time was described as the Watergate Committee was going to get a summary of some portions of some tapes verified by Senator Stennis. Then, during the day, came the report, that what Senator Ervin thought he had agreed to was an actual transcript of some portions of the tapes. Now, where does this matter stand vis-a-vis the Watergate Committee? Does the President have a deal with the Watergate Committee, or does he not?
Dan, that has to be answered from 2 points of view. One is the specific question of the quarrel that's arisen over the form of the agreement and whether the agreement is being respected, because the language has been changing a lot. And the other is what's going to happen to the agreement, if there still is one, under the impact of this triple play series of firings of the Justice Department today. I know that tonight the chairman of the committee, Senator Ervin, said, I suppose we still have an agreement, but we'll have to see. And the vice chairman, Baker of Tennessee, said that while the situation is fluid, it's very difficult to say, indicating that they're aware that this onrush of events may have overtaken the agreement that was reached yesterday. Now, earlier today, Senator Stennis, who has agreed to screen the tapes, as you indicated, to eliminate military secrets and irrelevant material, was discussing some of the technical problems of accomplishing his mission.
I've never seen the tapes. I don't know how they're going to look and how difficult it'll be to hear and rehear. Frankly, I've been told that there's some there that's almost unintelligible. I mean, you can't hear it. So it's going to be breaks there. I mean, times when you're going to have to stop and play it and replay it.
But you're not trained in the technicalities of tapes, and how are you going to decide whether or not this is a suspicious tape?
Well, I don't know. I didn't undertake the authenticity. I just say that if I find evidence that it is, why, I'll say so.
Do you have that White House okay to do that?
Oh, yes. I've got a free hand in this thing. Yes. Well, that didn't come up except to assure me that they were authentic.
Well, even while Senator Stennis was wondering about the technicalities of how he goes about his mission, the whole agreement that provides for his mission was already under a great strain. Mr. Nixon, as you suggested, Dan, said in his statement last night that he would write a summary of the tapes, which Senator Stennis could then check against the tapes by listening to them. This was not exactly what was proposed by the now former Attorney General Richardson, who had talked about a verbatim transcript. It also wasn't what Senators Ervin and Baker said that they had heard from the president when they visited him at the White House yesterday. Their understanding was that it would not be a summary, but a verbatim transcript. And that may be of some importance because somehow a summary can elide certain things, even though, with all goodwill, Senator Stennis has gone over it. Well, early this evening, Senator Ervin said he had a telephone call from Fred Buzzard, the president's special counsel, and that Buzzard had assured him that it would indeed be a transcript and not a summary. And so it seemed for a few minutes at least as though this little crisis, which preceded a much larger crisis, had been settled. But then what happened? This evening, one White House official came out and said, no, that Mr. Buzzard, when he talked to Senator Ervin, only said we are in agreement in a very vague and general way, never giving him any specific assurance that there was going to be a transcript and that perhaps Senator Ervin had somewhat exaggerated the terms of that rather vague assurance. And so, even if these Justice Department firings had not come so soon afterward, that agreement with the Watergate Committee or its leaders seemed about ready to come unstuck again. But now, in the wake of President Nixon's breathtaking triple play in the Justice Department, it seems unlikely that there can be business as usual with the Watergate Committee when everything else about Watergate is coming down with a crash.
Dan, just to add on to that, just before we came on the air, a White House official who would not allow use of his name, when asked to clarify this situation, well, will the Watergate Committee, or will it not, get actual transcripts of tapes? He said what Mr. Buzzard meant when he talked to Senator Ervin was that the Watergate Committee would get summaries that would include some transcripts of some portions of some tapes, and that seems to be where the matter stands at the moment. Now, picking up the story from, and we realize how complicated this story is and how swiftly it has moved, and we're trying to put it in some perspective as best we can. Last night, after the president announced this plan and announced that he had agreement from the Senate Watergate Committee, he ordered Special Prosecutor Cox to stop trying to get access to the tapes and to certain records. If Cox didn't stop, the president said last evening, he would fire Cox. Thus, about what happened tonight, a sense of inevitability began building at midday today as Cox held a news conference. Cox said he would not comply with the president's demand, and he claimed the president was trying to change his promise that Cox could be independent. Cox was asked why he ever took the job.
There was a widespread feeling that there was need for an investigation conducted by someone wholly outside the administration who believed in the normal processes of the grand jury and the courts, who would follow them and adhere to them, and who wouldn't be subject to instructions that might call him off or impede his work. And the purpose of this was to make it plain that the country would get such an investigation. It happened to be me. It may have been a good choice or a bad choice. But this changes it. And I don't think I could properly go on without making it plain that there had been a change. I don't mean to seem to cling to power or office. If my personal ease were the test, I'd be on the coast of Maine and not here. But I do think it important to do everything I can to emphasize the extent of the departure from the kind of detached, independent public inquiry which the Senate caused to be set up. And once I have done everything I can to make that clear, then I'd be happy to relax.
My colleague Fred Graham, journalist and lawyer, has been at the special prosecutor's office. Fred, what has happened there?
Well, Dan, you know, Special Prosecutor Cox brought together about 40 of the brightest young lawyers, most of them young, in the country, and there was enough to make a Wall Street law firm recruiter drool with envy. More than half of them were graduates of the Harvard Law School. 7 of them had been Supreme Court justices' clerks, and they were an elite group. They had all moved here. Some of them had bought homes, the unlucky ones. Some of them intended to stay probably with the prosecution force 2, 3, perhaps 4 years. And there was a commitment there of young people to right the wrongs of Watergate. The suspicion began to spread, as you mentioned earlier, some 24 hours ago, that something was in the wind. Jim Doyle, who was a spokesman for Archibald Cox, said tonight that last night the task force chiefs of the 5 task forces in the prosecution force prudently carried home copies of memos having to do with their work. But then suddenly tonight, within 30 minutes after the time that it was announced that Special Prosecutor Cox had been fired, FBI agents moved in. They sealed off the office. It's in a private office building in the heart of Washington. It looks like any other office building. And members of the force were not permitted to take out anything but their personal items, not personal papers, only personal items. Tonight, they discovered that their organization has been abolished, their jobs eliminated, and their files sealed by the FBI. Henry Ruth, who is Cox's second-in-command, explained how it felt.
We have received no official notice of our status. We have not been told officially about the abolishment of the office of Special Prosecutor. I must say, I suppose that human emotions take over in this kind of occasion, because one thinks that in a democracy maybe this would not happen, and that maybe we could proceed in good faith to prosecute those who have violated the criminal law. Apparently that is not to be the case, and we have been abolished, and we're to pick up our things, if we're allowed to pick up our personal things, and go home. I guess everything's happened so suddenly that I can't think through what it all means to the country. That a solemn promise of the nation's chief law enforcement officer to the Senate of the United States will not be fulfilled, and it will be abolished by fiat of the chief executive without consultation, apparently, with representatives of other branches of government. And I was thinking in the car coming in that perhaps it wasn't 7 days in May, but maybe this is 1 day in October.
Well, it's clear that the atmosphere at the prosecution force office is one of stunned disbelief, and no one seems to know what's going to happen from here, Dan.
And so the Cox task force is closed, though Mr. Ziegler assures us that the Watergate investigation, in his words, will continue vigorously. And the 2 top men at the Justice Department have resigned. So who's running the place? Fred Graham will tell us after this message. Five men have headed the Justice Department under President Nixon in the past 18 months. 3 different men were in charge of the Justice Department at one time or another today alone. The last of them, the man now in charge, is Robert Bork. Who is Bork? Fred Graham.
Well, Dan, I don't believe anyone has ever been catapulted into the leadership of the Justice Department quite as rapidly as Robert H. Bork. He is a 44-year-old former law professor who was an extremely conservative but obscure professor at Yale in 1968 when Richard Nixon was running for president. Bork wrote a magazine article at that time in the liberal magazine, The New Republic, entitled, why I am for Richard Nixon. There weren't many Ivy League professors for Nixon in those days, and it came very much to the attention of President Nixon and the leaders of his administration that Professor Bork was on his side. So when the president needed help in 1972 to draft his anti-busing legislation, he called in Professor Bork from Yale as a consultant, and Bork came. Bork impressed Nixon, and last June, Nixon made him Solicitor General, the third-ranking official in the Justice Department. Of course, with no idea that the events of today would come, but rather, people at the Justice Department thought, with the idea that Bork would be groomed to become another one of the stalwart conservative nominees in the Nixon mold to someday sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. All that seems out of the question now. It seems unlikely that the president would even send Bork's name to Congress as a nominee to be Attorney General, or the name of any other person to be Attorney General for the time being, as confirmation would seem unlikely. What seems more likely is that Bork may well run the Justice Department, perhaps for many months, as acting Attorney General. And indeed, tonight, his wife told CBS News that we consider this only an interim appointment, Dan.
Well, Fred, would you think that he would have any chance at all of being a viable possible nominee for the Supreme Court now that he has taken this job?
Well, I think this is going to be a very controversial position, to say the least.
Well, I want to go to Nelson Benton. Nelson is still on the lawn of the White House. Nelson, is there any indication from anyone at the White House whether they now consider the nomination of Vice Presidential Designate Gerald Ford to be in any difficulty as a result of what's happened today?
Dan, oddly enough, in the conversations that I had, the name of Vice Presidential nominee Gerald Ford never came up. It was one of those typical Saturdays at the White House. I usually see the White House on Saturday when you're away. And the only thing that was different was that everybody stayed late. Everybody expected something. Mrs. Nixon was taking tourists through the Rose Garden, signing autographs and having her picture taken with them this afternoon. A very pleasant surface, a very roiled underneath, and then the announcement tonight on the house cleaning. It was one of those strange Saturdays here, Dan.
Well, while no one at the White House seems to be discussing Congressman Ford's possible future as the vice presidential nominee, there were some people in Congress as early as late this afternoon, before some of the events of this evening happened, who were saying that at the very least Congressman Ford's nomination would continue to be held hostage until and if the president released the Watergate tapes. Dan Shore, I know we've been trying for more congressional reaction. I believe you have some additional reaction, do you not?
Yes, and there's one, I guess, that is very fitting tonight because it comes from the candidate in 1972 who, according to testimony before the Watergate Committee, was one of the chief victims of what Watergate produced. Of course, that's Senator Edmund Muskie. He says, I believe that these events are of such gravity and consequence to our form of government that the House should consider holding hearings on the impeachment of the president. What the president has done, and I continue quoting, threatens to destroy our system of laws. It smacks of dictatorship. Unless Congress responds in the only way provided in the Constitution for resisting such a usurpation of authority, we endanger our country's future. Senator Muskie.
Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, that may be the strongest indication toward a possible move in the direction of impeachment from any senator in recent days. True or not?
Well, Senator Brooke has also suggested impeachment. Senator Mondale, Senator Case. I don't think it'll be a serious move for impeachment until we get others than senators and victims.
Fred Graham, what, if anything, does the court now do? It was a federal district court order first that the president appealed to a federal appeals court. The president worked out this plan, which he calls a compromise. Now what happens with the courts?
Well, Judge Sirica, who entered this order, could theoretically move on his own to hold the president in contempt. Whether that'll happen remains to be seen, but there is a grand jury here. And we've been hearing all along, Dan, that there's some very strong-minded people in that grand jury who believe that they need to see what's on the tapes to do justice in this case. And it's not impossible that a special counsel for the grand jury could be appointed funded by Congress perhaps, to fill right in where the special prosecutor left off, and he could not be fired by the president. He would be a judicial officer.
Could that special counsel possibly be Archibald Cox?
Well, he mentioned it today, but I do not believe he would take that. He said it would appear that he was on a personal vendetta against the president, so it would be someone else.
Dan Shore, what's the next step for the Watergate Committee?
Next up for the Watergate Committee, Senator Weicker, who is the only member of the Watergate Committee who, even before tonight's events, had come out in categoric opposition to the arrangement with the White House, insists on having a very early meeting of the committee in executive session next week, probably on Tuesday. Now there's all the more reason, because they really have to consider, they're in this very strange position, that if they go ahead with a plan, they're going to go ahead with a plan when everybody else in Congress, or a great many people in Congress, are up in arms against the administration. Certainly this Watergate Committee would find itself embarrassed to be the only ones now cooperating with what now looks like a shadow administration.
Fred Graham, what does all of this say about the tapes themselves?
Well, Dan, the president has said from the first that the only reason he's been unwilling to turn over the tapes in pursuant to these subpoenas is that it would violate some principle of confidentiality, that future advisors would be afraid to speak freely to a president. But it seems to me that now that the president has taken these historic and unprecedented steps to resist turning the tapes over, that more and more people are going to wonder if perhaps there isn't something on those tapes that the president simply cannot let see the light of day.
Dan Shore, we're running out of time, but speaking of time, what about the timing of the president's announcements of last night and the events of tonight?
Well, you know, Secretary Kissinger is in Moscow. Saudi Arabia has decided today to cut off oil. There have been constant evocations of international crisis. It's a good international crisis weekend to carry out an act of this sort, I guess.
Other reporters helped us this evening put together this special CBS report. Phil Jones, John Meyer, Tony Sargent, Jed Duval, and Neil Strasser. Now for my colleagues Daniel Shore and Fred Graham, Dan Rather, CBS News, Washington, good night.